Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, children of all ages, welcome to Immoral Action. I am your host, Jeffrey Joseph, your friendly neighborhood youth minister, and joining me once again is Levi Checkers.
It's
Welcome
good
to
to
the
be
pod.
here today again, Jeff.
Excellent, excellent. So, as Levi already knows, I have a full show in store for you. We've got a lot of things to cover. But I'm going to start with an analogy to something comic booky, because as you can see, I have comic books littered around the room behind me. And so, what I want to talk about fundamentally is the media, and I'll get to why in a minute. So, obviously, you and I have watched a number of these Marvel movies like Captain America Winter Soldier. And part of the problem in Captain America Winter Soldier is obviously if we have a problem, if you have a problem at home, your first instinct should be, I need to call the cops. But what do you do if you know that all the cops are corrupt? Now, I'm not saying that's the case in the real world, but nonetheless, who do you go to if you can't go to the regular authorities? And that's the
Captain
issue that he
America.
faces. Yeah, Captain America. Obviously, you first go to Captain America. My first response probably would have been Ghostbusters, but they're just as plausible as Captain America. Who are you going to call? Well, Steve Rogers. He's right there for you. But part of what they try to do, and they touch upon this in Daredevil, actually. I don't know how much of that you've watched it all, but another excellent series by Netflix. And part of what they try to aspire to in that is that if you can't go to the regular authority figures, you got to go to the media, because the fourth estate exists there in theory as another possible check and balance for the powers that be in our society. And it's generally associated with the media, the fourth estate. Um, but of course, in Daredevil, the way that they address it is that, well, if somebody's in control of the authority figures, why wouldn't they also be able to manipulate the media and things like that? So, touching on something that we talked about in the past, I referenced a Sean McElwee article from this organization called Demos, and it is an intentionally progressive think tank, essentially, that tries to do research into factors that contribute to inequalities and wealth and um, ownership of property and things like that. But recently, I was listening to one of their fellows. That's just not just a fancy way for me to refer to him as a person, but actually a fellow at this institute. He talked about how part of why he grew interested in this project is he was thinking about doing the law school track and trying to be a lawyer and things, but he was drawn to the idea of advocacy journalism. And the way that he described this was journalism with a goal, so goal-oriented journalism. But my question to you is there a place for legitimate advocacy journalism or goal-oriented journalism in the modern media landscape? Or is that basically just a response to the way that, for example, a Fox News has tried to manipulate coverage intentionally? In other words, is it just another vehicle for propaganda?
I mean, that's a good question. There's certainly an element to which, uh, as you mentioned with Fox News, they take bits and pieces of what is going on and they spin it into a certain light. I remember watching some seriously gut-wrenching footage of discussion about the CIA torture information being released, and the Fox pundits talking about, oh, well, isn't this just a ploy by the liberals? Oh, this isn't really torture. It's not really so bad. And that being genuinely disturbing to me, because one of the few things that ethicists can agree on almost universally is that trying to remember who, one human rights theorist says that if we have any rights, the most fundamental right is the right against torture.
Mm-hmm.
And if we have news people who have a very large audience talking about torture as that if it ain't no thing, then there's something seriously wrong with that. But of course, on the other side, if you're reporting things with just a different slant, there's also something wrong with that. So the issue, I mean, we can think of things like the way that certain statistics are reported, or the way that data is skewed or related to make it seem that things are worse than they could be. But what seems to, and I think I was reading a blog piece uh, recently that was talking about some of the statistics that are thrown around with regards to feminism, that the issue of 77 cents on the dollar is a bit misleading as a statistic for various reasons that I'm not going to go into, uh, but it's used to make a point, right? I mean, regardless of how accurate that number is, the point is that women aren't paid nearly the same amount that men are. But of course, it seems to me that there's a lot of information we could easily report on that doesn't need to be skewed, right? When we can talk about things like the wealth gap in the United States without having to skew the information one way or another, because the numbers themselves are very jarring. We can talk about pollution in and around the world in fairly practical terms without having to skew it because the information there is fairly jarring. We can talk about the fact that since the Industrial Revolution, we've destroyed about 80% of the world's forests. We don't have to skew that one way or another without that being alarming or surprising. So there is, I think, the need or the felt need to skew information is troubling. But I think there's something interesting about that. And the piece that you had sent me to look at covering the Rolling Stone rape allegation debacle is an interesting case. There's certainly a big issue surrounding sexual violence, surrounding so-called rape culture in the United States, especially at college campuses. But what made that story stand out was that it was personalized, right? And this is something that is a little interesting, I think, about the way that information is conveyed to American audiences for the most part. I don't know if this is true in other cultures as well, but we respond better to stories, individual stories, than we do to statistics, than we do to cold hard facts. So I remember with the 2012 presidential election, this debate between Joe Biden and Senator Ryan, and somebody had made a comment about Mitt Romney being pretty anti-educational or being just an overall scummy dude. Mm-hmm. And Senator Ryan told this story about how Governor Romney had paid the college tuition of two young men from his home congregation after they had gotten in a car accident or something. And I remember listening to this and thinking, well, what does that have to do with public policy? It has nothing to do with public policy, but it's a nice story that people react well to. And that's kind of the way that a lot of debate and public opinion goes. Is this a story that I can relate to? Does this matter if it represents facts at all? Right? The whole pull yourself up by your bootstraps idea goes along with that. It doesn't matter what the statistics are about African Americans, for example, living in poverty and working in poverty. But if we can point to a few examples of, well, look at Colin Powell, look what he did with his life. Or look at Jay-Z, look how he's very successful and very knowledgeable and very suave. Why can't everybody else do that?
Right. And part of my inspiration for being troubled by the story, of course, is because I do have a history in the media, and I used to work for a website that was very deliberate in the way that it intended to seek out its goals, that it was largely intentionally progressive, to the point where I still remember the first story that I wrote at the behest of the editor, and he wanted a particular angle, and he wanted me to write about it in a very particular way. And I said, I'll write what I can find. And I wanted to be able to back up everything I said. And I wrote what I could find as I believe it was trying to tie Saudi oil to Rupert Murdoch, because what I wrote about was largely about Fox News. But I wrote it. It wasn't exactly what he wanted. He took what I wrote, which was probably about 4 paragraphs. He added about 9 paragraphs after that, and then he published it, and he had my name on it. And that's part of why I am troubled by it. To this day, I still have qualms about having let that article go up with my name on it, because I did think that I had things there that were valid, but there were only maybe 4 paragraphs of it. And the vast majority of that article was just the editor choosing to spout whatever his theories were without really any support behind it. Um, and so while I criticize and point the finger at Fox News, I can also say the same of the left of that particular website, of MSNBC, who tries to emulate what Fox News has done. And I think it is possible to just do straight journalism without having to do deliberately advocacy journalism that would still improve society. And what I guess I'm really troubled by in general is that this idea that we feel like we have to. Is it a necessary evil that we have to start doing something like goal-oriented journalism? That in order to fight the messaging from one side or the other, we would have to forget journalistic ethics, whatever they may be in general, and because journalism, as a function of society, you would think that journalism wouldn't come in with a preconceived notion that they would try to find the truth, rather than I am working toward this, and so that's what I'm going to find. To a degree, of course, if you're working in like the metro section of the newspaper, you're going to focus on stories in the metro area. But beyond that, you're not trying to deliberately manipulate something other than to find the truth and expose the truth. And you mentioned the Rolling Stone story, which part of what's troubling about it, of course, is that there was this huge Rolling Stone story about the rape culture at University of Virginia. Unfortunately, that story did not pass any credibility tests, and it seems that many of the people involved could have done much more to fact check the story to find the many, many holes within it. But the really unfortunate part is that now it gives people ammunition to be contrary in regards to addressing the idea of a so-called rape culture in university settings. And I think recently that has come into the fore for the national stage, because we have the NFL draft, the NFL, which is the number one sport in all of the United States right now. And the presumed number one pick is a gentleman named Jameis Winston, who's probably the most professional ready quarterback in the league, who I believe 2 years ago was accused of sexually assaulting this woman. And of course, in light of this University of Virginia story from Rolling Stone, many people will be able to say as detractors that, oh, this woman is just looking for publicity. She's just looking for a handout of some kind. And maybe somewhat to her detriment, she has worked with producers to create a documentary called The Hunting Ground that specifically documents her experience with the Jameis Winston situation. And I think for the most part, most people can see how a town that is centered on football would not want their star quarterback to be implicated in this particular case. And in fact, when the officer has gone, it's on record that the officer had told her, you realize that he is the quarterback of the football team. Do you really want to go through this knowing that this is a football town? Which that could be taken either way. A, he may be actually genuinely trying to protect her, or B, he might just be trying to protect the quarterback. And yet that issue is more of a hush-hush situation, and even further complicated by the fact that he is an African-American male and it happens to be a white woman. And this only plays to the notion of the historical racism about how black men are always just trying to rape white women.
Right.
And so an issue that deserves a much deeper and more serious look, we're left with, well, stories about rape that have hit the mainstream media. They've been debunked. So, of course, they're just going to come after this man. And now it's what might have been seen as a progressive outlook to say this guy should be investigated further and more seriously for what he's done, is now taking a step back because it could be perceived as just another example of racism toward a successful black student athlete.
Right. And this is one of the difficulty with current discussions regarding rape and rape allegations is that anytime a false allegation comes out, anytime it's revealed, it's used as proof against the validity of most rape allegations. Of course, that's sort of like, obviously if someone falsely accuses another person of rape, and if things go to trial, that can really ruin a person's life. Not that not necessarily the person, well, certainly the person who's accusing, but the accused will certainly be branded in very negative light through society, because we do, for the most part, take rape seriously. But of course, on the other hand, if people are afraid of having their accusations be called out or being dismissed as hysterics, then that really creates a harmful atmosphere. And one of the difficulties surrounding this is that anybody, whatever the issue is, well, there's a broader issue that has to be talked about, and probably this session right now isn't the way or the place to talk about this, but the issue of the permissiveness of of how sexual experiences are portrayed, and how many men understand sex as something that is somehow owed to them, or somehow, right? I mean, there's I think I don't remember if we've had this discussion before, but in contemporary discussions of sexuality or sexual ethics, things tend to either go on the strongly Christian side, that any sex outside of marriage is wrong. And if you're really Catholic, then even sex inside of marriage, if you use birth control, you have to use the rhythm method as you're supporting the old banner.
The rhythm method, ladies and gentlemen, the rhythm method.
But the other side then being just that, well, any sex is okay, and sex, as long as it's consensual, is fine, and there's no issues. But there's still this very strange stress on sex, and sex being some sort of affirmation of personhood. That if I'm, the stereotype of the virgin being like something, oh, there's something wrong with you, right? Sex being a rite of passage almost. That if you want to be a man, you have to engage in sex, and that sex is your right, right? There's something about that mindset that really needs to be corrected in society. And as long as that persists, I guess I did just go into it, but as long as that persists, it's going to be this problem that when a woman accuses a man of rape, there will be this question of, well, was she really raped? I mean, wasn't he just maybe a little bit more aggressive than she wanted? Isn't she just trying to get revenge on him? There will be suspicion surrounding it, as long as sex is seen as a right for men. So the issue with this question of the NFL draft going on, it becomes a sort of difficulty that in some cases, depending on how we view athletes, and I believe you had this discussion with Joe last week, often they just get, a slap on the wrist at most. A few years ago at Notre Dame, there was allegations of one of the football players sexually assaulting a young woman from St. Mary's College. Mm-hmm. And there was no investigation into what was going on with that. And a few months later, she committed suicide. And the implication, journalistically construed, was that her suicide was related to the fact that nobody believed her allegations. And the football player remained playing. There was no investigation into what was going on. And so there is certainly it's a delicate issue by all accounts, but we don't really treat it the right way. We have people who report on it, like the Rolling Stone, who just say, well, look, everybody, all of these frat boys are raping. Or we have people who patently dismiss it and say, well, no, that woman's just being hysterical. She wasn't really raped. She was upset at him later on, or something like that. And we're not really creating an atmosphere that allows for a good investigation and discussion of the issue of rape.
Yeah, and Pick up on a quick point, you've used the term hysterical, obviously, in a pejorative sense here. And for those who don't know, obviously, Levi and I both know that the etymology of the word hysterical is much like hysterectomy. It points to a particular part of the female anatomy. And so it is not only a pejorative term in that, like, it just means crazy. It's really a crazy associated exclusively with women. So it is fundamentally is a sexist term. And that's why when he's talking about something like hysteria or hysterics or things like that, he's talking about it in a very negative light because it is a transparently, if you look at the etymology, sexist term, but it is something that absolutely comes up in these discussions as a way to perceive the way that these women are acting, because it's very dismissive, and it gets the point across that obviously you can't take this person seriously because this person is crazy, and the subtext is because that's how women are, pretty much.
Right, women, am I right?
All right. And my next question then would be, so we have the situation that we need some kind of middle ground. And I talked to Joe about this a little bit, but does that mean that as consumers of culture, do we need the media to actually reiterate when it comes to athletes or things like that, that they have, not only do they have off the field issues, as they often say, but specifically identify what those issues are? Or should we just leave it at off the field issues and allow the consumer to go ahead and find out what those off the field issues are if they so choose? Because obviously, especially for a sports media, there are many people who are going to sports as a relief from, the drudgery of the day, whatever it might be, and maybe they don't want to hear about it every time. And some of them know. Many of them, I would argue, don't know all of the details, and they don't want to know. But is it their journalistic obligation, or does sports media inhabit some other form of media that isn't held to the same standards that we would expect from a broad newspaper or even a Rolling Stone magazine or something like that?
Well, I think to begin thinking about this issue, it's important to realize that nothing in our culture is isolated. That the way we think about sports is related to the way we think about other things, that if we insist on ethics in one area, it should be across the board. When we talk about corruption in the government, we also can talk about corruption in the NFL and corruption in businesses. That ethics should be across the board. We shouldn't just say, well, ethics is fine for the way you personally. This is a side note. This was one of the big issues that I have with leaving virtue ethics as a comprehensive system, is that virtue ethics is very good for developing personal ethics and personal goodness, but it's not very good at addressing questions of social ethics. But these are all interrelated, right? And of course, sure, if you develop the virtue of justice, you also have to render justice to everybody in society. So of course, we can't just say, well, I'm virtuous in everything else, but I treat my neighbor badly, or I don't care about people who are poor. Then you wouldn't be a very virtuous person. But all of these things have to be interconnected. Ethics goes across all borders, and somebody like Michael Walzer will write a book called Spheres of Justice. He has written a book called Spheres of Justice, in which he discusses how justice occurs in different spheres of our life, including politics, the market, the family, religion, across political boundaries, like between the United States and Mexico, for example. He deals with this question: what is justice in these situations? Because it is different. When we get to something like the media, when we get to something like sports, we can't sort of dismiss what's going on the field or off the field as being unrelated to whatever else is going on in the rest of society. These things are all sort of interconnected. And I think I'm going to sort of switch the conversation a little bit, because I'm not great with sports, but something that you and I are both interested in, video games, as you know, has gotten a lot of attention in the media for being destructive or harmful. And back in 2012 with the Sandy Hook shooting, remember that was one of the first things that Wayne LaPierre, the spokesman for the NRA, came out and said before people actually knew what was going or knew anything about the shooter. oh, this was because of video games, not because of the fact that his mom was a gun enthusiast and had several legally purchased guns laying around the house and was going to buy her son a gun for Christmas. Not because of that, but because of video games. But he said something that was actually very interesting in his press conference, that we have this culture of violence promoting and encouraging violence. And I think that's actually true. That's one of the few things that I agree with him on. I think that video games are a symptom and not the cause. I think when we have, that if you criticize American foreign policy and the military, you're seen as unpatriotic or a traitor, rather than someone who's saying we don't need to be fighting all of these people and demonizing people from the Middle East and demonizing Muslims. If you criticize police work as being too brutal, then you're seen as being a cop hater, rather than someone who says, no, we need to be more accountable for the way we enforce things. If you think that gun culture is harmful, you're seen as being somehow less of an American, trying to take away our guns, rather than saying, you don't need a gun because you're not hunting deer. You don't live in a situation where you need a gun to live. And these are all elements of our society, and the movies, video games, books, the machismo culture, all of that it goes across these borders between social and personal, and it creates this sort of air where violence is much more readily acceptable. So we see athletes often, to bring this back to athletes, we see them as sort of perhaps being removed from the personal dealings of everyday people, but they're connected. And if we accept the violence that goes on off the field, we sort of accept it as just what happens. But of course, there can be a higher standard, and this was something that I started looking into for a paper I wrote a while ago. That it is okay to say that first-person shooters are too violent. It is okay to say that these games are basically the equivalent of cotton candy. They're not really doing anything good for you, and they might be not helping you. But there's also ways we can improve that, right? I mean, video games aren't limited to first-person shooters. There are a lot of interesting, even some first-person shooters go beyond just the kill everything that moves. But there are games that encourage you to think about how to solve puzzles. There are games that encourage you to think about diplomacy issues. There are games that encourage you to think about the way we relate to other people. And those are the things that need to be brought up, and those are the things that should be explored more by conscientious game developers. With regards to media reporting on sports, then I think there needs to be a sort of accountability, that if Ben Roethlisberger is sexually assaulting women in Pittsburgh, that needs to be reported, because being somebody's idol as a football player is not an excuse for being a morally terrible person in other areas of their life, right? And this isn't something that we should think that we're immune from, because if we tacitly accept that as, well, that's just what they do, then we're also saying that there's no standard, there's no need for people to be good people, there's no need for justice in our society, because, well, what I do in my office is not related to what I do in my home. Well, they are related, right? You shouldn't really call a person a good person because he treats his wife and children fine, but he's destroying many people's livelihoods at the office.
Absolutely. And there's a lot to respond to there, so I'll do my best here to try to keep it all tied in together. I think something that the commissioner of the NFL, for example, talks about when it's convenient, because it's basically whenever he wants to punish somebody, is he'll say that playing in the NFL is a privilege, not a right. And yet, most athletes believe or live a way that seems to believe that playing in the NFL is a right. So if they are suspended for doing something terrible, for example, Greg Hardy, who was found guilty of assaulting his girlfriend at the time, he finally, last year he was not allowed to play, but this year he's actually suspended, because last year he was not allowed to play, but he was still paid. And then by all accounts, he used that money that he earned while not playing to pay off the woman so that she would not appear and testify at the jury trial, so that the charges were eventually thrown out. So that now it seems as though he was never charged ultimately in the eyes of the law, although he was definitively found guilty. It's just that, as the prosecutors themselves have said, he paid her off, and so now she refuses to testify. And so now this year he's getting suspended for 10 games out of the 16-game regular season, and he will undoubtedly dispute this 10-game suspension as though he were not guilty of anything, and as though him being able to play is his right because he is a very talented player. And so that's another complication where he believes that it is his right, and the commissioner probably could and should say that it is his privilege. But then at the same time, the commissioner, who has been very poor, although getting better about dealing with domestic violence issues and really just dealing with so many of the issues, but especially as they relate to violence toward women, he has treated the activity of the NFL as a right to continue rather than as a privilege for himself and for the league, because they happen to be a multi-billion-dollar industry. So that's a complication with that. To talk a little bit more about video games, this last week I had to teach a third grade class for our religious education class because the person who was normally in there, she happened to need to go to the hospital with her husband. So I happened to be in this third grade class, and at the beginning of the class, one of my students was talking to me about Mortal Kombat X, which just came out. And he was telling me in very vivid detail all the fatalities he knows, all of the X-ray moves, which the X-ray moves, if you don't know, are just moves where you do an attack and then an X-ray camera comes in close and shows you how the bones are shattering and things like that. And I could not believe that this third grader knew all about Mortal Kombat X, and his parents were allowing him to play a game like Mortal Kombat X. And I thought back to almost about 20 years ago when the original Mortal Kombat came out. And sure enough, I had that original Mortal Kombat when it came out. And I was probably not much older, if older at all, than that kid was or is now when I was first playing Mortal Kombat. And the violence, to be sure, has been exacerbated over the years. It's definitely even gorier than it has ever been, without a doubt. So there is that to contend with for some difference. But basically, for some reason, I thought it was okay for me to have that Mortal Kombat years ago, and I don't feel like it scarred me through the years, having had that experience back then. But yes, definitely, as I've gotten older, I wonder, how can you expose a child so young to something as violent as that? These particular parents, I have to wonder if they thought anything of it at all, because it does not seem like they tried to limit him in any way in his exposure to this sort of violence. And we know of so many kids, like we joke about how many 8 to 10-year-olds are basically playing Call of Duty and destroying adults while playing Call of Duty and just raining all kinds of death and pain and things like that in games like this. And yet, to be somewhat fair to Call of Duty has, as a series, and it's an annualized series, they make millions upon millions of dollars. That's why they can annualize a series like this, because of their multiplayer, really. But they do have story mode, and occasionally in the story mode, they have taken chances with the story to try to, on some level, make real the violence that is incurred throughout the game, including having the character basically act as a cell member of a terrorist cell, and then have that character die after having the option to basically murder total innocence and try to get you to grapple with that decision. But I don't know that. I mean, that happened one time, basically, as far as I know, in the Call of Duty franchise. And it was in a story mode, the campaign mode, that most people who actually play Call of Duty don't even care about, because they're mostly just there for the online multiplayer anyway. So are there particular examples of games that you think are doing this well, or models maybe for games in the future for how they could continue to do this better?
Yeah, that's a good question, and I do have answers for that one. I'm trying to remember the issue with the NFL. Maybe to make a comment on that first. It seems one of the issues there, just to keep, to probably another discussion that should be done on a different time, but one of the problems in contemporary culture and it's not really contemporary. This is something that's persisted throughout history. Is that those who are powerful, especially politically or economically powerful, are able to escape the bonds of common morality. They can buy themselves out of jail, and this is always the sort of thing that we have to keep in mind when somebody does armed robbery, even if they don't even if they don't fire a weapon, even if it's just holding a knife or something, they end up getting much more time in jail than somebody who is a white collar criminal who ruins thousands of people's lives, right? In terms of the utilitarian view, the white collar criminal is much more culpable and much more guilty of crime than the person who was probably raised in a bad situation and resulted to ripping off convenience stores.
Sure.
We don't treat things that way, and that's one of the big problems going on in our culture, that if you have a certain amount of money, it seems that it doesn't matter what you do, because at most you'll get sort of a censure, you'll get discredited, or worst comes to worst, you might be punished more severely than you should. And if we think back, a couple presidencies ago, there was a big scandal about blowjob gate with President Clinton. I'm not sure if I'm allowed to say that on here.
Yeah, you just did. It's done.
Yeah, the Monica Lewinsky scandal. We think back about that and how many people were calling for the impeachment of President Clinton versus President Bush going to war on false premises. How many thousands of Americans died in Iraq, or how many thousands of Iraqis were killed, or how many millions were displaced, right? That's much graver of a sin than personal infidelity in terms of your job as a politician, right? On a personal level, we might say, well, President Clinton, you shouldn't have done that. But that doesn't really affect his ability to govern. But going back to the video game thing, which is more interesting in some aspects, there are some games I think that really do a better job than others. And I think, that when the BioShock games came out, they were praised for the way they created a new environment and they pushed you to think about new things. They're basically, I believe people said they were Atlas Shrugged underwater. I never read the book, so, thank God. But they often dealt with the question of what happens if you live in a completely libertarian society where people are allowed to use whatever chemicals and drugs they want, where people are allowed to amass whatever fortunes they want, where there are no real laws governing what's going to happen, and you're running around in a world full of crazy people in the game. Mm-hmm. Another game that I think does a very good job of this, very underrated game, Sleeping Dogs, which a game you sent me. It takes place, the way it feels like Grand Theft Auto in Hong Kong, but you play as an undercover cop, and you deal with questions about corruption, about loyalty to gang members. It blurs a lot of moral lines, right? Is it wrong to feel bad that this criminal was killed because he was your friend, he was someone you were close to? Is it okay to feel glad that this cop was killed because he was really corrupt, right? Mm-hmm. And then there are scenes in that, and there's one of the things that I think is also very interesting is that games over the past 20 years or so have integrated a sort of morality scheme. And you begin seeing this with a lot of, what's his name? Peter. He's going to listen to this and he's going to be upset. The guy who does the Fable games.
Molyneux, right? M-O-L-Y-N-E. Yep.
M-O-L-Y-N-E-U-X. He's British, but he has a French name.
Yeah, that was racist. Sorry.
He created he's had several games, black and white games. You play God, but you can be a good God, you can be a benevolent God, or you can be a harmful, malicious god. Then he created the Fable games where you can become the good champion of Albion, or you can become the evil scourge of Albion. And then, of course, many other games have played on that theme. You can be good, you can be bad. The Elder Scrolls games, if you develop, you can develop negative reputations among certain groups. You can do the same thing with the Fallout games. And these were sort of created as experiments in thinking about morality, and they would be good if they didn't trivialize morality. So the problem is, actually, I think that within these games, it's often better to be bad than to be good. In the first Fable game, for example, at the very end, you're given this, and here's a spoiler, if you're planning on playing a game that's more than 10 years old and don't want to know how it ends, skip forward. But at the very end, you're given this chance to sacrifice your mom and sister for this really sweet sword, right? So it's like, where is morality there? And it gives you a different ending. So there's also that, like, okay, so I'll save the game right there, and then I'll kill my mom and sister and get the sweet sword. And then I'll go back through and play it again and not get the really sweet sword, but have my mom and sister still alive. It's sort of like, then it becomes one of many things. The Witcher games were really bad at this. The first game, you're called to be the middle ground. The path of the Witcher is the neutral path. But there's this genocide going on. The human beings are killing off elves, dwarves, and other non-human species. And so the game encourages you to take a neutral stance rather than saying, you should be championing the rights of these people who are being oppressed. And that's harmful. So the game Sleeping Dogs, on the other hand, what they do really nicely is they don't give you the option. And I think that's actually good. They don't say, hey, you can support these police or you can support these criminals. They just say, this is what the story is. This is where you're going. And it teaches you something more important, because life is about choosing, but it's not about trying to see what's the optimal outcome. Well, if I choose to do this, can I go back and then later choose to do that? I mean, we don't really do that in real life, but we can see stories unfold, and that's important. So I think Sleeping Dogs does a great job of that. I think many adventure games and some RPGs place a lot of emphasis on story and place a lot of emphasis on the relationship between characters, and I think that's also important, right? The Chrono Trigger, for example, has a very high emphasis on story, and you get to know the characters. You get to sort of have sympathy for them. There's that side mission towards the end. And here's another spoiler for a game that's 20 years old now. After you get the chance to save the forest, right, with Robo. You know this part of the game because you and I are
it's my favorite game of all time. Yes, coincidentally.
You take Robo and you build the forest essentially. When you come back and get him, you remember Luca has this dream, and it's a flashback really to her when she was a young girl, and she's able to do this because Robo has given her this special gift that allows her to somehow go back 20 years. And you find out that Luca's mom has her legs crushed in the machine that her father created. And you learn something about her family dynamics, that the reason her mother is so cold regarding her inventor nature is because it caused her pain 20 years ago. The reason why there's tension in the household is because something really tragic happened. But you have the chance to fix that. And if you do, then Luca's mother is much more warm and kind and friendly when you go back and visit her home. If you don't, then you realize why she isn't. And it's kind of sad for you. You're like, oh, I didn't save her when I could have. And you feel, I felt at least, you feel the pain that might have, or at least a small amount of pain that Luca might have felt. So they tend to be games that are not first-person shooters tend to do a better job of this. But it really depends on who made the game, what the purpose was of making the game, and what are the game mechanics? So again, like something like BioShock can do a better job than the Doom games. And not to say that the Doom games are bad, but to say, you're just going around killing aliens. There's nothing really there's no big nuance there.
Right. But even a game like Doom, part of the premise, I think at least originally, if not continuing on, was that they're potentially aliens, but also I think originally the impression was that actually they're demons who are fighting from hell. So obviously you just try to wreak as much destruction as possible, and you have free reign because these are intrinsically evil beings, and you are doing the universe a solid by bothering to eliminate these people from existence, or these not people, but these beings, these creatures from existence. Uh, and I think you're right that most games that are not shooters tend to do this better. The first game that I thought of that I'd played relatively recently was Heavy Rain, which is sort of an adventure game, and it does try to inject some level of morality into the game and force you to consider what you're going to do. But often those considerations are sort of like Saw level moral quandaries, like to spoil a game that is not quite as old as a 20-year-old game, but there is a scene where you can get to play as a father whose son is kidnapped, and you have the opportunity either to try to basically reject whatever torture mechanism your torturer has set before you, or you could do what the torturer wants and just cut off your arm. And that's a choice you get to make. Either there's a chance that you might be able to save your son and your arm, but you don't know for sure. And all the impression that you have is that if you don't cut off your arm, that your son may die, or may die more quickly, or what have you. So there are instances of that in that game, but I do think that there are more deliberate efforts to really engross the player in the game in a way that are unique from the way that we used to. I mean, like even a Chrono Trigger as a role-playing game, because Chrono doesn't speak, you don't hear Chrono throughout the entire game, it is a lot easier to identify with that character. And that was partly a technological limitation, that obviously there weren't voices in that game. But even as far as like speaking parts, those are not things that are prevalent for somebody like a Chrono or other RPG characters from years ago, so much as they are now. And there may be an argument to be made that, for example, Link from all the Legend of Zelda games has never really had a voice. I mean, he'll scream and things like that, but there's an argument to be made that you can identify with him, and thus with his decisions and his foibles and things like that more, because he can't talk. And especially with the resurgence of indie games now, and the way that they have taken over a lot of the market because of iPhone games and things like that, that maybe that is something that they can aspire to do and do successfully, and maybe better than most AAA games, is because of the technological limitations, they'll be forced to give you a better story. Although, a quick aside about iPhone games, Wayne LaPierre, who did point to video games as the downfall of society and things like that, the NRA did release an app where you could shoot things. Effectively, they released a video game. So this is more than a little hypocritical for them to point at video games and as if they were distant from themselves, in terms of that's why there was all this violence in Newtown. But actually, to go back to that a little bit, and to tie it back into the overarching thought here, has the media somehow failed in that we live in a different news cycle now, right, than we would have 20 years ago, 30 years ago? And actually, we've talked about this, and it actually is brought up in Daredevil, to tie back into comics a little bit, although I don't want to spoil who says it. But the point is, it is brought up in Daredevil that we live in a society now where something as complicated as systematic injustice is too complicated for most people. And so if it doesn't appear on the news and a quick clip, then we aren't going to really understand, or we're going to choose not to understand the real injustice to appreciate the injustice. And actually, John Oliver talks about this with Edward Snowden. He showed pictures of Edward Snowden for last week tonight with John Oliver. He showed pictures of Edward Snowden and asked people who he was, and not a single person knew who Edward Snowden was and is. Now that is a man who's living in Russia now because he bothered to release information about the way that the NSA was spying on U.S. citizens, not just people abroad, but on U.S. citizens, collecting data and things like that. and people just don't care. That, as far as most people are concerned, he is some treasonous loser who is abroad because if he came back, he'd be justifiably put in prison forever, if not killed, because he is such a traitor. And John Oliver tried to explain to him that the only way that you can get this across to people, and the way that you could do it is in 5 seconds, is to say, and he asked him, so Snowden, could the NSA and does the NSA have the ability to, without a warrant, collect my pictures of my junk that I might send to my significant other? And of course, Edward Snowden says, yes, absolutely. They do have that capability. That's part of the problem. It is a much more complicated problem than John Oliver said, no, just leave it at that, man. All you need to let people know is that they could be stealing your pictures of your junk or whatever nude photos of yourself that you might be sending your significant other. The NSA may be collecting that. And that is because, for the most part, the media doesn't want to delve into this longer story. But is it a failure of the media that we can't think about it more deeply than that, that we think about only the immediate response to some particular reaction that's sensational? Like when it came to Monica Lewinsky and Bill Clinton, it was immediately a story about fellatio, right? Now, legally, the only reason why they had any grounding at all for impeaching him was because he lied about his infidelity. But substantively, there was nothing more than he was not faithful to his wife, which was not the first time that Bill Clinton was unfaithful to his wife, as any Arkansan could tell you. Going back years and years, those stories came out many, many years before he ever became president. But the media chose, especially Fox News, and this is how Fox News became what it is today, chose to pile on this fact of him being unfaithful. And that's all that the media reacted to. So is it the role of the media, or is it the role of all of us, I guess would be my counter, to try to actively delve more into these stories? And how could we do it other than, we've talked about video games, but how else do we approach these situations better?
That's a good question. And I'm reminded, I mean, the thing that comes to mind immediately for me is that when, in recent tragedies with the Sandy Hook shooting and the Boston Marathon bombing, for example, I was glued to NBC's discussion of it while information was coming out, and I remember how quickly the reporters were to just jump at any information they could find, misreporting who did the shooting at Sandy Hook, for example, misreporting information about the brothers. I mean, we remember there was a young man who turned himself in to, I believe, the FBI or the state police in Massachusetts because some newspaper in New York reported him as being the bomber because there was a picture of him with a backpack on, right? Mm-hmm. He was scared for his life because journalism, you have to be the first person who's got the story, you've got to have the lead, you've got to really get the scoop, otherwise you're left out. With Sandy Hook shooting, there were the young man's brother who did the shooting. His older brother was immediately implicated because somebody at a news station reported the wrong name, and people were harassing his brother, like, how could you do such a thing? And he's like, I didn't do this. I don't know what you're talking about. So there's a sort of felt need for the media to develop the story even when the story is not there yet, right? And that's a big problem with having technology like TVs and the internet, that it's not enough to be able to like look and see a headline that says 20 children killed in Newtown, Connecticut. It's not enough to like have that and then find out later. We have to find out now what's going on. And the problem is then, because we feel this need to know things now immediately, and I think this is a problem that's exacerbated by technologies, especially social media. We live in this mindset where we always have to be stimulated by new information. So the Edward Snowden case is a good case where, when he was originally accused of treason, this was all over the news, but that's now a couple of years ago, right? And a similar thing happened with Julian Assange. I think if you ask people, in fact, I was surprised watching this clip from John Oliver, WikiLeaks came up, in the
Right.
discussion with other people when he interviewed other people. But at no point did John Oliver mention anything about how Edward Snowden's case was similar to Julian Assange, who did much of the same thing, or Chelsea Manning, who had done much of the same thing, exposing American secrets that could have been that involved some military action to a certain extent, and how those names have been forgotten because something new has come up, because now we have Edward Snowden, and his name has been forgotten because now there's a video of a cat playing with a string on my Facebook news feed. We have this sort of, remember back in the 90s, there was this beginning discussion of how media shortens our attention span. And I think The Simpsons did some gag with that, where Bart Simpson was like, I can't listen to this story. It's not, I don't know. There was some gag with, you have to have things shortened down into reasonable sound bites. You have to have things limited. And there was even John Oliver and Edward Snowden's discussion, right? One of the things they discuss is, how can we reduce this so it can be presented to people? And that's a problem, right? Because it's not something you can reduce. It's not something that should be reduced. When we're talking about something like, going back to the beginning of our conversation, something about how rape is perceived in our culture, it shouldn't be reduced to, was this woman raped or not? Is she accusing somebody falsely or not? It should be a discussion about, why do we have to ask that question? What are the issues underlying this discussion? What does it mean to have rape culture? What does it mean to dismiss that? What does it mean to be a misogynist? And I wonder if this is a problem created by the media. I know that that people like Hannah Arendt and Martin Heidegger were very skeptical of mass media, and Soren Kierkegaard was also skeptical of print media, of the way that it necessarily truncates and limits our discussion. And they're all skeptical of the role of journalism and media, but it doesn't really answer the question of what those things should do. And it doesn't answer the question of what their responsibility is. And I think there needs to be a greater a moment of pause in reporting developing stories. I think there needs to be reminders to people of what's going on in the world, right? It's perhaps difficult when we do have access to so much information and so many developing stories, but perhaps when there are slow days in the media, that would be a good chance to say, hey, let's remember that that the NSA is still listening to our conversations. Let's remember that Michael Brown's that Officer Wilson was not indicted for shooting an unarmed black man. Let's remember that there is still a huge gap between the rich and the poor. Let's remember that there are lots of other issues going on around the world, and not just, here's your feel-good news for today, or here's something going on in a part of the world that doesn't, here's a story that doesn't have much significance.
Well, I think that's absolutely true, and I think it's interesting. And a link that I sent to you was, sometimes we are reminded of these incidents not because people are deliberately trying to remind us of them, but because of the reaction against bothering to remind people of these incidents. For example, Tim McGraw, country singer. I've never listened to Tim McGraw in my life, but I did live in Arkansas, so I know who he is. Tim McGraw was doing a charity function in Connecticut as a way to raise funds for people in response to the Sandy Hook shooting. And then there was a significant reaction from the right, arguably a significant portion of Tim McGraw's audience, against him for bothering to raise funds for people in response to the Sandy Hook shooting. The idea being that, how could you be opposed to gun rights as a country singer, or just as an American, or what have you? And he had to explain to them that while he is in favor of gun rights, he owns multiple firearms himself. He still nonetheless felt the responsibility to support this cause because it was obviously a terrible thing that happened. And you would think that most people would recognize that fundamentally what they're opposed to is charity toward the families that, and it could be that these funds were deliberately set apart for being anti-gun, but nonetheless, fundamentally the way that it's going to come across is that they are opposed to supporting these families who suffered a great tragedy at the hands of a man who happened to have had access to many guns. And people like yourself and myself, we would believe that it is very closely tied to the very easy access to the guns that fundamentally allowed this to happen. But nonetheless, how are you going to oppose somebody doing charity work for a community that was obviously torn from this incident? And then it's not because people are celebrating in any way an anniversary or an anniversary of mourning for the event, but it's because of the reaction that became a national headline.
Right, and it's similar to the way that Fox News covered the release of the CIA torture files. That, oh, this is a ploy from the left, when in fact this is one of the few areas where, you know, in the Catholic Church, people from the left and the right side of the aisle all just people of good faith all say, no, this is something that's fundamentally wrong. I was pleasantly surprised at the response from John McCain, someone whom I normally don't really look up to, who had been a prisoner of war, and his response to the overall negative response of conservatives of how could you do this? Do you know what it's like to be someone who's tortured? Do you know what it's like? It's dehumanizing. We can't think of ourselves as somehow morally superior if we do this. And a similar thing would be, I had another thought, but then it just evaporated.
That happens. But
so there's
to continue on with that, and that's why doing things like that, saying things like that, despite the fact that John McCain very vehemently opposed Obama, obviously directly when he campaigned directly against him as a Republican candidate. But when he says things like that, those are the comments that he makes that make people like Rand Paul say that John McCain and others of his ilk are like the lapdogs of Obama or things like that. Because anytime that you say anything that is not directly opposed, then you are obviously in support, and it implies that all of your support must then be behind the opposing party. That's how you get to be called things like a rhino Republican in name only, and from the left that happens too. You know, Cornel West criticizes Obama even though he once campaigned for him, and now vehemently criticizes Obama, and some would say to an exaggerated extent if you read the New Republic article by Michael Eric Dyson evaluating the way that he does this. He's very critical of the celebrity that Cornel West has become, because he was once a scholar and now he's more of a celebrity and just an angry figure in politics. But my point is that it does elaborate how on both sides we have become, in large part, it seems, a nation or society of hot takes, where if you are not immediately supporting everything that I do, then you must be immediately in a polarized way, the opposite of what I support.
Right, and that's a difficult development. I went to it wasn't really a conference, but a presentation put on by the Dominican school here. Dominicans as in the friars, not as in like people of a certain ethnic background. The Dominican school put on a talk, or hosted a panel, including Jean Porter, who's, you know, I think you've probably read some of her stuff, does natural law. The talk was on, or the panel was on natural law in the public sphere. And one of the things that they discussed was the need for a sort of public common ground discussion about what is good, what is the common good. But of course, we don't, the air of public discourse currently is not amenable to that. We have, as you mentioned, you're either, you know, very strongly to if somebody seems not to be working in favor of you, then they're against you. I read just earlier this morning or yesterday a blog piece from somebody who was criticizing the what's been termed social justice warriors, that if you tend to disagree with some things that certain feminists or certain LGBT rights advocates or certain African American advocates are advocating for, then you're seen as racist or misogynistic or homophobic. And on the other hand, if you tend to say, well, maybe this is something that the Mormon Church has interestingly gotten criticism for. Recently, the Mormon Church said that LGBT people should have rights, that they should be excluded from work or from work or certain. They should have certain basic rights like housing rights and employment rights, etc. And some people said, well, how can you say that? You're condoning their behavior, their sinful behavior. I thought we were following Christ or something like that. So there's a certain amount in which there's no room for that. And I think a lot of that's polarized by the media. You worked for Stop Fox or
Turn off Fox.
Turn Off Fox, and your main target was Glenn Beck, right?
TurnOffFox.com. That used to be a thing.
His work is it's hard to listen to if you're a person who has any love for humanity, because he's full of a lot of bile. I mean, he's very incensed about everything, and he provokes people to be incensed about the things that he's incensed about.
He's intentionally vitriolic, very intentionally, very vitriolic.
Right, and a lot of people turn to him for news. He was at one point the second most listened to radio personality in America. I don't think he is anymore. He was kicked off of Fox, wasn't he?
He was indeed.
But that's troubling, right? That he would be such a big name and have such influence on many people's way of thinking, and whether or not people were already racist or misogynistic or misanthropic or whatever before listening to him. I assume it seems to me that most people who listened to him became worse after, and that's difficult, right? There does need to be a certain amount of pause, and perhaps journalism needs to stick more with the facts, or maybe people who do advocacy journalism need to take better ethics courses to know that that advocating for awful things is a bad thing to do, that being Glenn Beck makes you morally terrible. I don't know. But I do think that the way things are set up now in public discourse, and the way that language is sort of polarized, makes it difficult to have any sort of commonality. I think the way it's very interesting to hear how conservatives blast President Obama, for example, when his tax rate is lower than President Reagan's, when he's actually done less. And this is, I think, Cornel West's critique is that Obama painted himself as a progressive, but he's really not as far left as someone like Cornel West would like. That all of these conservatives have painted him as a socialist, but people who are socialists would really wish that he would be more socialistic.
Right. And not that I can't believe I'm about to do this, but to try to explain Glenn Beck at least a little bit. And I hesitate to say to defend him, because Mr. Checketts and I here have very strong opinions about Glenn Beck and the way that he operates. But having investigated him some and having written about him some, I will say that he does. I think the way that it is justified for him is that he self-identifies as a clown. And that's not just me throwing a pejorative at him. Certain people have called him that, but he also self-identifies as a clown, much in the same way that Jon Stewart, though he has had a very strong and powerful voice and is often identified with with the left, with a more progressive outlook, but ultimately deflects any acceptance of real weight in society because he self-identifies as a clown, as a comedian. Similarly, Glenn Beck, and this could simply just be a form of self-deprecation, but I think it is possible that he is aware of what he's doing. He self-identifies as a clown, and as such, while he broadcasts with this idea that he's trying to organize the people of the U.S. and try to create a new society and all of this stuff, at the end of the day, when he is pushed back against by the media, assuming they are not doing a piece on them with some preordained outlook of trying to denigrate him that he knows of, when he is pushed against by the media, he self-identifies as a clown, basically to say, well, I'm just this one dude who says crazy things on the air, and people like it and they listen. And if you look at his history and the way that he appreciated and tries to draw from Orwellian radio and things like that, he is very cognizant of what he does and the way that he does it. And he's also cognizant of the fact that he makes a lot of money doing it. And so the way that I have been able to read him as justifying it is that I don't know that he takes himself as seriously as many of his listeners do. And he is not necessarily the only person, obviously, who does this. Well, there was an article recently about how a mega church pastor in Georgia has been trying to raise $65 million so that he can have a personal jet to be able to fly himself and his employees around the world. And when pushed back against, his response was, basically, I dare you not to let me dream. I dare you not to let me dream, and to let God let me dream, as if that is what God wants for him. And this is, of course, an outgrowth of the prosperity gospel, which is often associated with Joel Osteen and people like him. But it is for people like you and I, who actually do have a background in theology, a total misappropriation of the gospel to be trying to preach the gospel of prosperity, considering how often Jesus talks about mammon, which is equivalent of money or wealth or things like that, and the perils of mammon. It's obviously not something that Jesus wanted to associate with. It's not like Jesus had a flock of sheep or something like that, just amassed wealth throughout his lifetime. That's obviously not what Jesus was interested in, and yet these pastors will associate themselves with this and justify it in the name of God, in the same way that I think Glenn Beck justifies himself as, I'm a comedian, you shouldn't take me seriously, don't analyze me critically, because I don't analyze myself as critically as you do. And that would be a wrong category. It's a category problem for him. Much in the same way. Good.
I think the problem with that is that people do take him seriously. And so far as people do take seriously, he should be responsible for the content of what he's saying then. It's sort of, the old, oh, it's satire, you just don't understand, doesn't fly when people are being polarized. Doesn't really fly when bad things are happening because of it. Like there's this sort of tendency also for people to say something in controversial and then wait to see what people's response is. And if it's negative, well, oh, I was just joking, you just took me the wrong way. Right?
Or more popularly on Twitter, to say something that's really controversial, and then immediately afterward, when they see the controversy, oh, my phone got hacked. It's clearly that person was in control. They might have had multiple comments, but for this one series of comments, suddenly my phone got hacked, and that's how they get away with it.
Right. I think there's I think someone who's a public personality has a certain higher responsibility for what they say and the way that it's interpreted. And if it's being misconstrued, they have a responsibility to address that. If it's being misappropriated, they have a responsibility to address that. And if Glenn Beck is only saying, well, you misunderstood me, I was joking, when he's pushed, and he doesn't start his radio shows that way, he doesn't make it clear throughout his presentation that that's what he's doing, then he's not being very responsible. And I think that is perhaps to answer the question overall of the responsibility of journalism, I think journalists, insofar as they're putting out public information or they're creating stories that are being put out to the public, not creating, but I mean crafting stories, putting together all of the elements and presenting it in a coherent way. They are responsible for the content that they are providing. And if that information misleads people, then they're responsible for misleading them. It's sort of the way to bring this back to moral theology in a more concrete way. Mm-hmm. This is in 1 Corinthians, Paul talks about scandal, and he talks about eating meat, that most meat at the time that you could have bought from the market had been sacrificed to idols. That, you know, that nice McRib that you're eating was once an offering to Zeus. And so many Christians, early Christian converts, were sort of scandalized by this, that, oh, that, you know, that Paul guy, he's eating a McRib. Doesn't he know that's idolatry because that meat was offered to a false god? And Paul says, you know, there's really nothing wrong with eating meat because there's only one God. Because eating a chicken sandwich doesn't negate the reality of one God. It doesn't worship another God because there are no other gods. But Paul says, if this causes the weak to stumble, if this causes people who have less faith to lose their faith, then I have committed a sin. And so Paul advocates not eating meat, or, you know, analogously not doing something else if it causes somebody to lose their faith. And in the Catholic Church, this is scandal of the week. It's something that we often forget about when we when we glaze over things like the sex abuse crisis. But it is something that should be considered as a deep moral issue. And if a journalist is causing scandal of the week or something similar to that, then the journalist is also, I think, morally culpable.
And all I will say for that now is amen. Because we've gone on for quite a while, and we probably should go ahead and wrap it up. I will also, I guess, add that obviously it's not, while I have expressed qualms with the role the media plays and can play, obviously I've been a participant in the media, and this is another example of media and media analysis. So obviously I do think that there's some merit to it, but it also requires people to listen. So, and I don't mean that selfishly as in listen to us, although obviously everyone could and should, and obviously that would behoove them. But generally, people need to listen to the media insofar as listen to the deeper part of the story and really delve into those long form pieces and things like that, because that's where you find the real truth, not some Twitter headline. As much as that's funny and it can be useful, reading the headline itself is not enough. We need to go deeper. So I think with that, we've more or less come full circle. If you'd like to hit up Levi on Twitter, you can now at Checkits Levi. That's CheckettsLevi. And you can also hit me up on Twitter at A Moral Action. You should be able to spell that out. If you see this on YouTube, feel free to comment. On Facebook, also comment. If you listen to the audio-only version of this podcast, you're missing out on all the beautiful background that I have here. But nonetheless, leave a comment. Let us know what you think. And remember, as always, every action is a moral action. Thank you for listening.